to Real Economy, I'm Maithreyi Seetharaman. The gap between rich and poor is wide and only been heightened through the crisis. So this week we are grappling with the story of a quarter of Europe's population now at risk of poverty. So on the show, we'll take a look at how women in Europe are one of the most vulnerable groups when it comes to being at risk of poverty. Then we'll take a look at our future, our children, say, in Bulgaria, and what they need to be productive, inclusive citizens of the future. How do we do that? We're going to put that question to EuroChild Secretary General, whose network is all about achieving that goal. The next time you're out, really take a look around you. You may not realize that almost 1 out of every 4 people that you see is at risk of poverty. That's 122 million of us, or a quarter of developed Europe. Now, it's not the kind of extreme or absolute poverty that you think about in some other parts of the world. It's relative. So let's get a crash course on the difference.
Our world is home to almost 1 billion people like Juan, who earns less than $1.90 a day, may have no food and water, no housing, few clothes and no medicine. People like Juan are struggling to stay alive. They're living in extreme or absolute poverty. Marianne, Luis and Frank earn less than what's needed to maintain the minimum standard of living in their countries. They struggle to afford the basic things like housing, food and medical care. They live in relative poverty. Marianne earns 60% less than the average person in her country. Luis can't afford the basics of his society, whether it's meat or the ability to pay for rent or unexpected expenses. Frank's chances to work are very few. All three face a tough life of unemployment, poor housing and healthcare, and potential marginalisation from society. That's why the EU's 2020 goal is to bring 20 million people in Europe out of relative poverty.
Look at the numbers and you can understand that goal. Those most at risk, and also the ones who had more difficulty finding work, well, their numbers rose last year. Those who had nothing at all did a tad bit better with a little help from the Fund for European Aid for the Most Deprived. But here's the red flag that Monica Pinner explores. 12 million more women than men are at risk of poverty, and they were brought to the brink during the crisis.
A quarter of women across the EU are at risk of poverty or social exclusion. Dominique lives on the outskirts of Paris, and after 18 years working, part of that time as a director of a recreation centre, she lost her job. Hers is a story nearly half of Europe's unemployed, especially women, will recognise.
I lived on about €500 per month for 4 years, money I got from the government. I have a roof over my head. I pay €550 rent for a 16 square metre studio. I got €300 a month towards my rent. After I paid all my bills, I was left with just over €1 a day to live on.
Dominique finally landed temporary work as a cook at Épicerie Solidaire of Montreuil, one of the most populated communities outside Paris. Started by the association Aurore in 2013, last year it helped 390 vulnerable families participate in its workshops and buy discounted goods from its shelves.
There are around 1,000 people a month who use the Épicerie Solidaire. Around 1 in 5 are people who have a job, but who struggle to get to the end of the month. But I think that the crisis weakens the ones who are already on the edge and makes their chances of improving their lives more difficult.
With her temporary contract, Dominique now earns €800 a month, 20% below the French poverty threshold, a situation shared by more than 8 million people across the country, more than half of whom are women. That equates to 14.3% of all French women. Apply that same percentage across Europe, and it would mean 45 million women being at risk of poverty. At a European level, the latest data says that 6.7% of the EU population earned less than the so-called poverty threshold, which varies from country to country. The threshold can go, for example, from €103 per month in Romania to €1,600 in Luxembourg or €786 in Italy. But what doesn't change is the cost of social welfare. France spends around a quarter of its GDP on those at risk, above the EU average of 19.6%. It's therefore critical to reintegrate people like Dominique to ensure they contribute something back to society.
Joining us is a woman at the heart of this battle against poverty. Jonna Hainsworth is the Secretary General of EuroChild. This is a network of organisations working with and for children across the continent. Women, that has a massive impact when a section of society is that vulnerable. How do you view it?
There is a big gender gap across Europe today. And this is not only about women's access to the labour market and the gender pay gap, which is still very prevalent. And I think what society needs is gender balance, not only in the labour market, but also in our societies. Women are disadvantaged because there's discrimination prevalent throughout the labour market. Also, they're more likely to take career breaks, and because they simply take more of the household chores and the caring, which limits their availability.
When you look at the amount of funding that goes into addressing this issue, it's about 20% of European funding, for example. We're not really seeing that much of an impact, are we?
I think it's much more than funding. This is about a mindset change, and that has to come from bottom up. Of course, the EU has a very, very important role, and it has had an important role not only on funding, but also on legislative change. And what we're unfortunately seeing now in the current austerity and economic crisis is that the pressure is off. They feel this is not a priority anymore. If we're going to deliver economic growth in the long term, we need to keep the priority on equality between men and women. In the societies, there is this myth that it's about lazy adults who don't want to work, and that is so much not the reality. They might not be able to hold down a job because they have caring for elderly or caring for children, because of the transport challenges that they have to get to work whilst also taking children to school. And our societies are not constructed to really support people to stay in employment over time.
Well, that brings us to the fact that more children than adults live in poverty in Europe. These kids are paying the ultimate price for the precarious job situation of their parents and, of course, government cutbacks. Fanny Gorey went to find out what can be done now to make our future citizens productive engines for our economic growth.
Expressing his thoughts by drawing. That's how 13-year-old Simon deals with life in the Bulgarian capital, Sofia. Before, we all lived in the same room. It was very humid, and it was also cold. It was full of insects. We did well to move. Now I feel better. The insecurity Simon feels has many roots, including his parents' financial struggles. Changing house, staying in school and learning social skills are all helping Simon to move forward. He and his parents have achieved this, helped by social workers from SAPI, an organisation linked to the National Network for Children.
The government should support organizations and local authorities to provide adequate services for vulnerable children and families. This needs a systematic approach. It needs for the different sectors like education, health, social services to work together.
And that's the key when more than half of Bulgaria's children are at risk. 21 European countries have seen their at-risk numbers rise since 2008. Improving the job situation and supporting families with benefits and services could go a long way in helping kids. I would say that there are two reasons for child poverty. The first one is dysfunction at a family level. The other is dysfunction at a societal level, the weakness of institutions. We should first and foremost prevent parents falling into poverty. That's also part of Alliance for Children and Youth's work. The NGO provides material and psychological support to parents and children in need, along with informal education. But really, tackling the issue needs more.
In Europe, more than 1 in 4 children is at risk of poverty and social exclusion. That's 26 million children. Can Europe really afford to lose a generation?
Europe loses citizens who could contribute to the economy. The problem with poverty is that it really, affects one generation to the next. So actually we are seeing that in Europe it's getting worse. It needs to be supported by real actions with programs, projects and funding.
So the 24.8 billion euros of Euro funding by 2020 will certainly help. And maybe organisations like SAPI and children like Simon can keep on dreaming.
Still with us is Jonna Hainsworth. Janet, more children than adults are in poverty in Europe. What does that say about our society?
The highest numbers are children growing up in households with parents who are either not working, but an extraordinary number of children are actually living in households with a parent who is working. In the UK, for example, the cost of childcare can take up to a third of the family budget. Well, if you're left with two-thirds to pay for housing and all of the other services, it's incredibly challenging to hold the whole thing together.
Are we looking at just one or many lost generations if we keep going down this road?
What we are talking about is the investment needed. The result of that early investment is seen 20 years down the line. We know that politicians are elected on a 5-year basis, and the cycle needs a long-term vision. If we do not invest now, then consequences will go down not just this generation, but the next generation and the next.
How would you do this?
You could look at a strategy, a child-centred strategy that invests in older people, because children and families are often dependent on older people's not only care and support, but also financial resources. It's really looking at the society and community in general. It is somehow linked to national policies, but a lot is linked down to the bottom-up level of what is happening in our communities.
For short-term, medium-term, long-term goals, what should those be?
We have 26 million children living in poverty across Europe. Something is wrong. So let's prioritise a target to reduce poverty and look at it then in a holistic way of how we reduce poverty across the areas, not only resources and income support, but also access to health, housing, education, leisure and sport, community spaces where children can grow and flourish.
Jen, on that note, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for watching. Goodbye.